Hello, my name is Andy Schmuckler. I'm wondering how real can one be in this medium? How real is it okay to be? I'm saying that because I'm aware as I contemplate the situation in which we're all living. It's hurting me and weighing on me. And uh, it, I've talked with a couple of people who I'm close to in my life about, geez, I'm suffering. This is very burdensome to see what's happening, for example, in our country and also at the same time, other places on the planet, some very troubling things happening. That I'm hurting. And what I was told by a couple of people who I guess are in contact maybe with more one-to-one type, that everybody's feeling this. Well, of course, not everybody is feeling the same thing, but that a lot of people uh, are being weighed down by seeing all the ugliness that's uh, happening in the American political arena in these times. The power system of America, where we're heading toward a national decision about which way are we going to go. Like to preserve American democracy into the future or to head off into fascism. Uh, so if my friends are right, then and if then it, I'm imagining it might mean that I'm talking to other people now who are hurting in the same way. And I should make this bigger, I guess. And then there's the question that occurs to me: how real can I be, and how much is it useful to talk about this very disturbing thing that we're experiencing as Americans in this era? Maybe it's just adds to the burden to go into it. Maybe it's better strategically to just I do a lot of press the battle guy. I've been for more than a decade. Um, but so maybe one shouldn't look at some of the disheartening aspects because we want courage. We want the heart to be, full of the. There's another part of me which thinks that being real is what's most powerful. I don't know if that's true. It's what I believe in, and so even though there's a performance aspect for me of doing this video, I'm aware of wanting to be impactful, to have the impact that I think might be helpful as my contribution to can we Americans get out of this situation intact? Um, I just don't know um, that performance is best if it's at all different from just being what's real. And part of what's being real is that this is a challenging time, a disturbing time to be watching what's happening in America. There's a piece that I read a couple of live streams ago. I'm just going to read the beginning of it that captured indirectly what I feel. I live in this Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. I have a relationship with the population here that derives from my having done a whole decade of intensive talk radio conversations with this mostly conservative audience that I really appreciated and even maybe loved. And then also as a Democratic nominee for Congress here, after I saw things going really, really awry among the conservative America that I live in, uh, I have a relationship with it. And I wrote a piece several years ago that articulated as best I could, very indirectly, sort of what the experience has been for me that's really quite disturbing, that has to do with discovering a transformation that's occurred, that's threatening the survival of American democracy now, which is one of the ways of articulating what's going on. And I'll just read that opening part of this piece. It's called, the piece is called "When Evil Arises Among a People." And I had been dealing with this feeling when I wrote this thing. Well, when did it get published? I think it says here. 2019. I had been dealing with this feeling, well, since 2005, I would say, when it became impossible to have the kinds of meaningful conversations that I'd had on the radio. Anyway, I'd watched the transformation occurred, and it was continually on my mind. And then here, years later, I write this. For me, the most memorable scene in the memorable 1972 film Cabaret takes place somewhere in the German countryside. The time is the mid-1930s. And that means you're supposed to understand what's going on in Germany, in the context in which this is happening, the scene. We see various Germans of this rural area sitting at their tables outdoors, next to some country inn, engaged in convivial conversations that we don't hear, enjoying good cheer with their friends and neighbors. As the main characters, the characters the movie's about, are drinking their wine, a handsome German youth with a beautiful high tenor voice begins singing a song whose first lyrics are, "The sun on the meadow is summery warm, the stag in the forest runs free." The melody pierces the heart with its sweetness. At first, we see only the youth's handsome face. As he sings, the camera pulls back, so we gradually see more. Suddenly, startlingly, we see he's wearing an Nazi armband with its swastika. As the singing proceeds, the spirit of the song changes from the lyric sweetness of the opening into the aggressive drumbeat of a military anthem. The lone singer is joined by more and more of the crowd, whose faces have been transformed from the original warm friendliness into a look of angry resolve. The singing ends with the crowd giving Nazi salutes. The name of the song and its repetitive line at the end of each stanza is, "Tomorrow belongs to me." The first time I saw this scene, when the film first came out, this depiction of a human transformation toward darkness gave me gooseflesh. It gives one the chills to see people who shortly before seemed warm and friendly, being transformed right before our eyes into a menace that would soon inflict on the world one of its most unthinkable nightmares. So that's the opening. That's the thing that I most suffer to behold. It's not like a sudden transformation anymore, but there are a lot of ways in which it's just disturbing to see that transformation having occurred, and that we Americans are heading toward a major decision between very different American futures, in which a whole lot of our fellow countrymen seem to be in the grip of something that's very menacing. and I see it a lot. And I write an op-ed piece every week that goes out there, and usually I write what, for me, I'm intending as a message to the people in this area who are like those Bavarians sitting at the country inn in the rural German countryside of the mid 1930s. What can I say to them? What can I do that might reawaken them to the better angels of their nature, so that they're not supporting this thing that's stomping its feet at the end of the tomorrow belongs to me, not aligning itself with a fascist force. Well, I don't know what, but I'm continually composing these things and struggling with what to say. Now, I don't want to come across as, like my life is just got this nightmare in it, but it does have this nightmare in it. But at the same time, I get fed in other ways. Even though I know that being 78 has some unfortunate ways, it's not the same as being 28. I'm in rather good health for the number. Age is more than a number. But I feel pretty good. I don't, I'm not going to leap off the basketball court and get my hand above the rim like I might have in my late teens and early 20s. But I do okay. And especially that lady there in my wedding picture from 1986. I'm very fortunate. So April and I have long agreed that being a human being is not easy. And, the Buddhists say that suffering and life have suffering has a central role to play in life. And I struggle with how to understand that. But in any event, it is challenging being a human being. And one has one's blessings and one's curses. And one of the curses right now is that we're living in an America that's beset by some significant darkness. Let me bring this up. Maybe I should just split the screen between it and me. Oops, that doesn't work. Let me do that again. Oh, okay. What are some of the topics that I intend to talk about today? The main event is that second one. Will human civilization get it together or destroy itself? That's going to be a substantial piece that, in its published form, had the title "The Fate of Human Civilization." I retitled it here because I want the title itself to conjure up what really is at stake in the challenges that we are facing as a species, and more immediately also as Americans, because in my better human story, what we're dealing with as Americans is just one of the, even though a very major arena in which there's a still larger battle going on that's been part of the history of the human species ever since we stepped onto the path of civilization. So that's going to be the main event. I've always had it as a strategy to not get into the big picture right away because well, I just don't have a whole lot of sense that people are walking around ready to think about the big picture. Whereas I think that there are a lot of people who are walking around thinking about the immediate situation we find ourselves in. And this, our problem with the Supreme Court that I'm going to be talking about is part of that immediate situation. I mean, it is a bigger picture than something like, what's going to be the verdict in the New York case, or, Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of levels here, but the problem with the Supreme Court is part of not what happened to humankind, but part of what we're seeing on the American power system, that's connecting with that armband that that beautiful young man is wearing in that scene in Cabaret. I'll give you a little preview, which is that I, who have been a lover of the Supreme Court since 1964, when I took a great course in it. I've been a lover of the Supreme Court, and I am now asserting with a fair degree of certainty that this is substantially true, that the Supreme Court has become the opposite of what its role is supposed to be in the American power system. Somebody that has got the last word about how we deal with our conflicts peaceably and to achieve justice and the rule of law. They have become the opposite of that. They are pretty completely possessed as occupied territory by one of the conflicting parties in our central political battle. And it isn't just one of the parties, it's the party that's most destructive and ugly. In other words, the Supreme Court is now occupied territory by the fascist force that's threatening to overturn the America's constitutional order. So I'll be beginning with that. And then we'll go into a larger picture within which to see where is our species heading. When I say, will human civilization get it together or destroy itself? I intentionally do mean to say, we've reached a point where it can be seen fairly clearly, and that's my job, is to show it as clearly as I can, that it's going to be one of those or the other. That either we're going to get it together in the next not so many generations, so that human civilization is protected from self-destruction and can survive on this planet for the long haul. Or alternatively, we're going to destroy ourselves. And I say that, people probably are assuming, well, we've muddled through all this time. I mean, we've been doing this civilization thing for 10,000 years, or maybe 12,000. And things have been pretty, there's been a lot of destructiveness out there, and here we are. We've gotten to this point, so we muddled through with all that ugliness and people trying to make things work. So we'll get through too. We'll muddle through. Actually, that option, I think I can show, is disappearing. We'll either get it together a whole lot better than we have so far, or we'll destroy ourselves. It's the muddle through option is gradually just disappearing. We got to make a lot of real progress in a matter of. I often have talked about it in terms of 2 centuries or several generations, but I don't know how long we got. We could blow at any old time, actually, in a nuclear holocaust. But I think that we probably can make it for some generations, but we really got to accelerate our progress in terms of bringing the destructive forces under control. And going back to destructive, and then we got Israel paying big costs for its dark blundering. Maybe we'll get to that, and maybe we won't. But there's been news on. I've spoken multiple times on these videos about. I'm a lover of Israel, and I am repulsed by how its worst elements are in power and have been making really wrong choices, blunders, and crimes, as far as I can tell, crimes. And I've talked about that a bunch. blunders in the sense that Hamas set a trap for them and they just jumped right into it, contrary to their own interests, as well as to a lot of moral and international legal matters, apparently. I really don't know how to judge the warrant for Netanyahu, the International Criminal Court issuing arrest warrants for Netanyahu, the prime minister, and Gallant, the defense minister, along with the Hamas criminals. And I'm not going to pass a judgment on that, but it really does appear that the fact that there was a fascistic government in power on October 7th, and that can easily be argued, by the way, even before October 7th, it was showing its fascistic nature. That was proved to be a disaster for that nation, a nation with a lot of wonderfulness in it, that's having its worst elements, making its decision at a very crucial moment. And as a result of the crimes that fascists tend to create, which is also kind of a self-destructive blunder, well, the pigeons are coming home to roost. And the other story was that how 3 nations in the European Union, let's see, Norway, Portugal, and I forget what country, but 3 respectable nations have now recognized in some fashion that has no immediate consequences, but is a big symbolic message. They're now recognizing a Palestinian state. This is what Israel is reaping as a result of having such a power, making its decisions in a crucial moment that required a degree of wholeness of thinking and creativity and benign spirit to be able to respond to a terrible, terrible provocation in a way that makes sense. And that's, that idea about how a people can suffer, a nation can suffer if they give power to its worst elements. I mean, that takes us back to the election here in this country in 2024. We've had some experience of having the United States led on the world stage by Donald Trump. That was an ugly picture. And this promises to be, if he gets elected in 2024, it's going to be even uglier. It connects with the situation in Ukraine, for one thing, which is sort of like, one of the crucial cockpits about whether the United States is going to play this role or that role. You'll reelect Joe Biden and you have America and give him a Congress that won't do like what the House pro-Putin wing of the Republican Party, how they paralyze Congress from being able to continue to supply an ally that was in Ukraine that was doing very important things to protect American interests as well. Or if you choose Donald Trump, it's the pro-Putin wing of the American power system, supported by these Bavarian equivalents in our, will choose the path of like Trump said, inviting Putin, go ahead, work your will against our NATO allies that we are obligated by treaty for good reasons to come to the defense of. But, if we've got our version of Netanyahu's government making the decisions, all the destruction that could take place from that and all the pain that we would feel as Americans to be represented. So that's a situation I see the wonderfulness of Israel in having this government choosing the path forward at a moment where something very different needed to be making the decisions. And then there's that Nikki Haley thing about Nikki Haley joins the club of GOP moral midgets. I don't know if moral midgets was the right choice of Uh, let me take, but we there are a lot of Republicans leaders that basically we know understand something about what their party or their former party in some cases. Liz Cheney, let's take Liz Cheney. I mean, Liz Cheney is what a Republican should be with respect to the issue of the moment. And I expect, I mean, she's already out there. Not as strong as I could imagine her being, but I don't know what the right strategy would be. I mean, she's in what we want for people like Liz Cheney to be doing is whatever will best protect the survival of American democracy. We want that for them to be out there addressing those people with whom they have some credibility. That will be heard in a different way than if somebody like me or Joe Biden or Jamie Raskin might talk to them, all of which I think, we all should do what we can to help protect what's best about America. But she's in a position, being Dick Cheney's daughter and having been in Republican House leadership and being about as conservative as they get. Nonetheless, she recognizes that the preservation of our constitutional democracy and the rule of law is really the issue of the moment. And I expect her, I don't really know if I can say I expect her. I hope, let's just put it that way. I tend to be too optimistic. The opening of this podcast notwithstanding, I tend to make mistakes of prediction that when I look at my whole record, which I'm proud of mostly, but all the various mistakes I make, they're almost always in the direction of overestimating what people are going to do, like overestimating Robert Mueller for starters, overestimating what Mitt Romney might do. I mean, he voted for impeachment both times, but geez, if I were in Mitt Romney's position, I would be way out there. I mean, the stakes are such that, some people are going to write him off. But I mean, he's a decent human being, a man of faith. He's got a record. He was a 2012 Republican nominee for president. Surely he could do more. But he does what he does. And I'm hoping that what Liz Cheney will do, and as many other Republicans who can see what's what, that after preparing the way for the next several months of you must not vote for this force that the Trump and the Trump party is a betrayal of the nation and an assault on our heritage as Americans, whose founders gave us this wonderful system that was a big step forward for humankind in enthroning the will of the people as the sovereign. So I'm hoping that she'll do that for a few months as powerfully as she can, whatever that might look like. I don't know what it would look like, but I imagine it would look even bigger than what she's doing. I mean, when she gets up there and says, well, basically she says that it's unthinkable that a president essentially can try to overthrow the American government in one election, and then there not be any trial to show the American people what happened before the next election. I mean, that's a way of saying that she doesn't say that what the Supreme Court did in abetting Trump's desire to delay completely unnecessarily the trial with this bogus stuff. I mean, I think that the problem with the Supreme Court needs to be trumpeted out there. But anyway, so she could be going out there more powerfully than she is, but maybe she's got better judgment than I would. What do I know about how you reach and move the people who are sitting around in that Bavarian countryside with their steins of beer and transforming their faces from this friendliness that we started with to something that's going to visit a nightmare on the larger world. But in the last couple months, this is the play that I would call. If Liz Cheney called me up and she said, "Well, what do you think I should do?" And I would say, "Well, I think you should vote. Say, here's why you shouldn't vote for Trump and the Trump Party for the next several months, and then after the conventions or Labor Day, which are basically the same thing, I think you should be starting to tell people." Really, the only sensible choice is to vote for Joe Biden. There are two people are going to be. One's going to bring us the end of our constitutional order, and the other one, whatever else may be true, we know that there will be another election in 2028. So everything else about Joe Biden, you can say, is irrelevant. By the way, I think that a lot about Joe Biden is good, but you don't have to go there because people, for whatever reasons, most of which I don't understand fully, Biden is not registering all that powerfully with the American people. And I don't fully understand the reasons for that, but it's simply a demonstrable truth. But none of that's relevant. When you look at the actual options that we have between democracy and fascism, you got to go with Joe Biden, and I would like to hear Liz Cheney switch at that point to spend the last couple months before Election Day telling the people who might listen to her, whatever you think of Joe Biden, forget about it. He's the choice that we got to make, because the other alternative is simply unthinkable, unspeakable. And there we go back to what weighs me down so much. Having grown up in an America where, I spent a lot of years living under a president from a party that I didn't support, but never felt that party had left the consensus of America about how we do things and the need to do our competition within certain bounds. Like insurrections are outside of those bounds, that kind of a thing. So it's. I'll start with reading about the Supreme Court now. Let's see. I have the picture of me, and then I have a piece that I put on Daily Costs last week, or on Saturday, I guess it was. This was right after the story broke in the New York Times about how this flag, I'm calling it the flag of the insurrection, and just shortly after January 6th, that Justice Alito had an upside down American flag flying outside his house in, Alexandria, Virginia, just days after January 6th, and without its being taken down. And then I guess yesterday, I think the story broke that now there's another flag issue with Alito, that he's flying something which is basically sort of a message of identification with Christian nationalism, and how thoroughly such a thing violates the well-known ethics of being a judge in America. That one must avoid any overt expression of political allegiance of any kind. That's not the articulation of it, but that's basically That's the nature of the issue. On any other court, this would be a violation, of I think, an enforceable major rule about how a judge must and must not conduct itself to avoid not only being corrupt, but any appearance of being partisan, corrupt in a partisan way. So it was that big story about the Alito's flag that inspired me last Saturday to write about how Alito and Thomas should both recuse themselves from cases involving the insurrection and presidential immunity, because if they sat on any other federal bench, the codes of judicial ethics would require them to recuse themselves. Yes, it's true. It is intolerable that the Supremes have set things up so that they alone of all federal employees are not subject to the rules that can be enforced upon them if they don't have the integrity to enforce such rules upon themselves. I'm all for judicial ethics being instituted. But we should not fool ourselves into thinking that this will even touch what's really gone wrong with this court. Even if Alito had been careful to keep such a flag from flying by his house, and even if Clarence Thomas had turned down the lavish gifts bestowed upon him by the billionaire class, and if Thomas's wife had not written pro-insurrection texts to the chief of staff of the president who was inciting that insurrection, we would still have this important problem. A majority on this court has turned the highest court in the land into territory controlled by the force of fascism that the Republican Party has become. No judicial code can save us from the implications of that terrible capture of that sacred, vital territory, the Supreme Court. It would always be a terrible thing if the court were to become the instrument of one of our two major political parties, continually serving that party's interests rather than applying the Constitution and the law in good faith. But the political party being served by this court's majority is something extraordinary in American history, extraordinary in all the worst, ugliest ways. No major political party in American history has been as ugly as this, so dishonest, so destructive, so unconcerned with the common good, so willing to help with the dismantling of American democracy and the rule of law. Like no political party in American history, indeed, like no major party in any of our peer advanced democracies, today's Republican Party has become a force of fascism. And this Supreme Court is the partisan ally of that fascist force. Here's how I fleshed out that fundamental problem. That the body that's supposed to have the last word on our political conflicts is now under the control of fascism. In a previous post on Daily Costs back in March. But by the way, it wasn't just on Daily Costs. This was one of my attempts to reach out to the intelligent, decent people I used to talk with on the talk radio conversations who are now part of the Trump Republican base. And they get public. It was an op-ed in the newspapers in which I ran in 2012. The title of the op-ed piece in the newspapers was America's Serious Supreme Court Problem. And I gave it that more neutral title because I'm hoping that I can get people to take a look, and if I signal that I'm going to say, that this Republic appointed court is fascistic, I got less chance that they're going to be willing to see what I've got to say. And how much chance I got anyway, who knows? Today's Supreme Court is the opposite of what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be the body that stands above the various parties and interests that are in conflict, and that resolves those conflicts according to the Constitution and the law. Instead, more than any Supreme Court in American history, this Supreme Court is an extension of one of America's major partisan interests. Now, partisanship has marred past Supreme Courts. The court that handed down the Dred Scott decision of 1857, for example, which claimed that, quote, the black man has no rights the white man was bound to respect, was dominated by the slave power. And the court from the 1870s to the 1930s consistently served the rising corporate power against the interests of workers and of the wider public. But those courts were excessively partisan on a specific category of issues, while today's court, at least this is how it appears to me, has been contorting the law, the Constitution, and justice on a variety of issues that have nothing in common except that they serve the interests of the Republican Party. What demonstrates that this court must be seen as purely partisan and not as conservative is that the opinions of the court majority, hands down, the opinions supposedly to explain their decisions on so many major cases, are so weak, so poor, so distorting of the Constitution, the law, and the history. Contrary to the rule of law, this court majority first puts getting the desired results and then fashions supposed justifications afterwards. In other words, the court is only pretending to do what the court is supposed to do, while actually serving the partisan interests that placed this Republican majority on the bench. For example, and here we got at least three bullet points. Opening the floodgates for money to buy political power in that Citizens United decision of, 2011? Thus taking power away from the American people and handing it to the plutocracy, which dominates the GOP. I don't go into showing how dominant the plutocracy is of the GOP, but it can be shown. Next bullet point. Gutting the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby decision, thus enabling the Republican-dominated states, particularly of the former Confederacy, to disenfranchise vulnerable groups that tend to support the Democratic Party. Plutocracy, white supremacy, both fit well into the fascistic pattern. Third bullet point, this is the last of the three. The court instituted an extreme reading of the Second Amendment in Heller, thus preserving for the Republican Party a mighty block of one-issue voters and assisting the plutocracy's divide and conquer strategy against the American people. And I know that I'm not showing that, but if you go to my website, abetterhumanstory.org, and search for something about Second Amendment or gun rights, I think I can show the way the Second Amendment is used to bring on a passionate bunch of voters on an issue which is not really of concern to the efforts of the mighty and the wealthy to steal more power and wealth away from average Americans, to concentrate more and more wealth and power at the top. But even if we knew none of this, what the court just did on Trump's bogus presidential immunity claim would suffice to show the blatant partisanship of this Republican-appointed court majority. What the court did with respect to an issue that quite clearly they should have handled in December and enabled the trial to go forward back then in Justice Chutkan's court. I mean, crystal clearly, they should have done what the court did with the Nixon tapes in 1974. Which is what the special prosecutor asked them to do. And at step after step after step, there's been no justification for any things that they've done that have made it improbable that there will be a trial before the election. The most serious crimes in American history had no reason not to be tried well before the election. And Justice Chutkan showed that there was no justification for Trump's appeal about presidential immunity, a completely bogus argument. They know it's a bogus argument, but they chose to side with the criminal against the rule of law, helping the criminal delay by months so that the American people cannot see what a trial would show. I mean, we're seeing with the New York trial that a trial can show people a lot. And the people might well be influenced by what they see. And that is really the expectation that Trump has had as he sought to delay and delay and delay. And the Supreme Court, I really didn't think that they would do this. I thought that there was enough integrity on the Supreme Court, or enough unwillingness to behave in so ridiculously unjustifiable a way that they would just let the thing go forward. The interests that put them on the court are not identical with Trump. I mean, it's a mixed picture. But they acted nakedly, not as the preservers of our Constitution, but as agents of the force that has openly been assaulting America's constitutional democracy. In a nutshell, this is what the court did. For no good reason, it abetted Donald Trump's ongoing effort to evade the rule of law by delaying his most important trial from happening before the presidential election. And then if he wins, the idea is he gets to make sure that he's never tried because he's president, and he's already signaled that what he's going to do to the Department of Justice is to make it an instrument of his intentions, not an independent agency to honor its oath of office and see that justice is done without fear or favor. No, they will fear and favor Donald Trump if he's elected, and there will be no trial. Here are the most essential facts that expose the court's unjustified alliance with Trump. It had been compellingly, irrefutably argued to the court that there's an enormous public interest in establishing Trump's innocence or guilt of these serious crimes before the citizenry must choose for whom to vote. Next bullet point. The Supreme Court has shown in the past that it can deal with such cases in a big hurry. Like when there's a compelling interest, as in Bush v. Gore in 2000, and like the Nixon tapes in 1974. But this court ignored the need for speed, acting for months as if time didn't matter. Next bullet point. There is really no need for the court to involve itself at all. The issue, legally, it's clear. There is no merit whatever in the Trump's argument that he cannot be prosecuted, no matter what crimes he may have committed as president. they're pretending to try to come up with general rules where there's no need for general rules. Really, there's no way to dispute that the crimes for which he's been indicted have no presidential immunity. Two courts already issued powerful and compelling decisions, utterly rejecting Trump's claim, and virtually every legal expert agrees. While the jury is obligated to grant Trump the presumption of innocence, we as citizens have no such obligation. Indeed, it is our obligation to use the huge body of available facts to draw conclusions vital to the decisions we have to make as citizens. And as everyone who is reasonably well informed should know, the evidence for Trump's guilt is overwhelming. But we needed a trial to show more and more of the American people, because that's what the preservation of American democracy requires. But that is what the court has chosen to prevent. And then I'll skip this, all the ways in which Trump's behavior shows he knows he's guilty. If he were innocent, he wouldn't behaving like this at all. Trump's campaign of delay is tantamount to a confession. Were the trials to go forward in a timely way, not only would the ugly reality of Trump's crimes be laid out publicly, but he would almost certainly emerge as a convicted felon. Well, I expect he'll be a convicted felon by late next week or so. But still, that case shows a lot, but something so fundamental as what the January 6th cases would have shown. There's no substitute for looking at those crimes. They are special. Many Republican voters have told pollsters they would not vote for Trump if he were convicted of such crimes. But again, I kind of wonder if the Manhattan convictions, which I anticipate, hasn't happened yet, will have nearly the impact of what would have happened if the trial that should have been conducted over the last several months in Judge Chutkan's court had been unfolding. Though that would have been very powerful, very important, vital to awakening all the Americans that might be awakened by seeing the truth. There is no good reason for the court to delay Trump's going to trial for the most serious crimes in American history. But there is a strong partisan reason for the court's months-long slow walking of Trump's meritless appeal, to the point where it looks unlikely that this most important trial can happen before November's election. A trial that would hurt the chances of the Republican standard bearer would damage also the chances of the down-ballot Republicans. The opposite of coattails, when the ugliness would get even more displayed to the American people through a trial. So it is that against the public interest, contrary to what democracy and the rule of law requires, obstructing the rule of law, this court majority has shown itself as partisan Republicans thinly disguised of their judicial robes. And then to repeat, partisan Republicans when the Republican Party has become, to a degree, way different from anything we saw about this once respectable Republican Party. The party of a fascist force. So that's the thing that I wanted to share here at the top of our topic list. Oh, I've already got that here. Let me put that up again. Our problem with the Supreme Court goes way deeper than any code of judicial ethics can touch. Yeah, I'd like to see Dick Durbin and Sheldon Whitehouse on the Senate Judiciary Committee, moving in whatever ways are possible. And they seem so almost, they seem so weak. I don't know if they have tools that they're not using. Um, I, they are concerned and they are doing things about judicial ethics and issuing a subpoena asking Chief Justice Roberts to appear before Congress as months ago. And then Congress basically gives them I don't mean Congress, I mean the Chief Justice basically gives them the finger, to quote the famous line from that Bogart film, Treasure of the Sierra Madre. Badge? Badge? I don't gotta show you no stinking badge. And he refuses to come and testify before Congress, as if they're exempt from the system of checks and balances. And so I hear Sheldon Whitehouse on MSNBC talking about, well, he really does have to come. And yeah, or what? Or what? The impunity with which Clarence Thomas, whose wife is basically part of the insurrection, does not recuse himself from cases that have to do with that attempt to overthrow a free and fair election. And we'll see what happens with Alito, but I'm as optimistic as I tend to be. I don't think Alito's going to act like he owes anybody anything. I think he thinks he's above all that. I mean, actually, I don't fully understand Alito's state of consciousness. I mean, there's a certain puzzle because I see his wearing his inquisitor of the Catholic faith who handed down the Dobbs decision. I see that spirit and the Christian nationalism, that he has some sense that somehow he's on God's side. But so what does he think about the importance of his oath of office? He probably put his hand on the Bible. I mean, he must have put his hand on the Bible and sworn an oath. He's violating it. We can all see that he's violating it. Is that okay with him? You swear an oath to God with your hand on the Bible? And somehow because you overturn Roe v. Wade, you're still a good guy? I don't get it. But I find it difficult in a lot of ways to understand how this whole swath of America has become so full of people who really think they're doing God's work. When if you look at the situation in any of the ways that have to do with wholeness and brokenness, please go take a look at how I lay it all out in my Better Human Story. We've got a problem of a force of brokenness, and people like Alito and those guys at that Bavarian Inn, they align themselves with a force of brokenness, which is really quite clear. And the godly, sacred way has got to do with a force of wholeness, which is the opposite. I don't fully understand just how people's minds get moved over into that place. I mean, that's part of why I find it so disturbing. That scene in Cabaret not only shows a transformation of what was beautiful a few minutes before becomes ugly. That in itself is, but it's also puzzling. What happened to those people? Now, I've written about how people can get transformed into their worst selves in a variety of situations, including what happened in Germany in the 1930s. And I include also a force, what happened in the American South in the 1850s, so that people by 1860, when Lincoln got elected, there was a huge readiness to launch a war that we still haven't healed from. Just a lot of destructiveness that comes from a frame of mind that people can be put into. And I have ways of explaining what happened in the American South, which are not so mysterious to me. I mean, I think I can explain it in terms of my understanding of the forces at work in human civilization, because the issue of slavery was really so central. And so it was really quite fundamental. It was inescapable. Big powers in the American system that were embedded from the beginning were contending, and this balance of power, I think, was shifting away from the slave power. And it was a huge issue, and America's attempts in 1820 and 1850 to paper over a huge conflict. There was a reason for the country to break. Doesn't mean it was inevitable. Doesn't mean that regardless of everything that happened, and there are certain points where you can think maybe it could have gone in a different way, and we could have solved this problem in a way that in the coming decades it essentially resolved itself without this ugly, ugly civil war. Maybe I don't know. But in the case of Germany, the German people had undergone, you can go to my website, abetterhumanstory.org, if you want to see this fleshed out, about the traumas of the German people. It's in that book a lot, A Better Human, What We're Up Against, which is free for you to read in a PDF on that website. And you can do a quick search on trauma, say. That will take you to the history of the Germans from like 1919 to say 1933, when Hitler gets semi-elected with a third of the vote and becomes chancellor. So, they went through a whole lot of stuff as a country that would upset the wholeness of people quite readily. You can understand between World War I and the Treaty of Versailles and the collapse of the whole social system and inflation, such that everybody's money became worthless overnight. That led to you can understand what might have been going on with that group that's sitting outside the tavern in Bavaria. When this boy singing in this scene, which of course it never would have happened like that, but it's a way of dramatizing the transformation that actually did occur, that the German people, say, of, before World War I, who were, they had their issues, the militarism, the anti-Semitism, the hierarchical and authoritarian dimensions that were embedded in German culture as problematic things were there. But there was a level of okayness about how the culture was working and where the people's heads were at, and the balance between the wholeness and the brokenness that's embedded in the German people. And then they go through all those traumas. And you can imagine that people would get broken. I mean, I've been through a certain amount of trauma in my life, and things get destabilized. Just 2 days ago, I had surgery on my right eye for a cataract. No big deal. Very successful. I learned yesterday on my post-op. But it's not nothing to go through something, and it has an impact. But you go through all of what they went through from 1914, when World War I breaks out, to 1933, almost 20 years, almost a generation. And you can end up really unmoored from the various cultural structures that kept you in kind of good order. And then, when I talk about these three periods when people undergo a transformation, I end with the sort of the mystery of what happened to the America in, say, since the first Bush presidency. I see Rush Limbaugh arising in the last couple of years of the first Bush presidency. I see the first Bush presidency as a normal Republican Party, basically, still within the confines. But that, beginning then, a transformation starting to happen. And from 1990, say, to this moment, where the equivalent of the people around that Bavarian country inn, who make up the Republican base, end up in a frame of mind that makes them support a political party that's no longer hiding what it represents and where it's coming from. Become increasingly naked with that pounding of the feet and the rage and the rage and the the willingness to embrace a whole web of falsehoods that create justifications for the rage against the evil on the other side, so that it's okay that the Supreme Court protects the worst criminal in American history, the serious threat to the constitutional order. It's okay. Because all of that initial cultural structure that I encountered among the conservatives that I loved back in the 1990s when I talked with them on the radio. I love their Christian values. Now they're supporting the opposite of Christian values. Not hard to show that. I mean, Donald Trump is actually quite explicit on some points that he is the opposite of Christian values. He is the opposite of the reverence for Constitution. I mean, he's willing to trample on it. He's shown that again and again. The party of law and order, he is the opposite of that. He's a one-man crime wave. It's not hidden. The party that used to, in the 1990s, talk about good character, and I thought that they were right in correcting liberal America about the importance of good character, they have given their fervent devotion to a single political figure who's able to coerce and dominate their political party. And they are completely behind him whenever he says, punish this, support this, support the big lie, punish anybody like Liz Cheney who decides that they're going to honor their oath of office rather than serve me. Boy, that's a big transformation. And unlike with the 1850s, we haven't split up over any really major issue like slavery. That was big, that was huge, that was unavoidable. The country didn't manage after the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850, et cetera, et cetera. The country did not manage to deal with it politically. No, unfortunately. The effort to deal with it politically failed, and we ended up fighting a terrible war. And unlike the German situation, the United States, the people of this country have not gone through that much trauma. I mean, history always gives you challenges. 9/11 was a challenge. It wasn't getting attacked by the Japanese Empire at Pearl Harbor. We weren't up against, some major fascistic regime. Hitler declares war on us after that. No, it wasn't like that. The financial crisis that was largely caused by, in a sense, the failure of I would say, the plutocratic force to act with integrity and good faith and not set a time bomb to blow up the world economy and the financial crisis with the mortgage time bombs in banks all over the world. But that wasn't huge either. I mean, it was big. We had a financial crisis that was bigger than any of the recessions that we had had since the Great Depression. But it wasn't the Great Depression. I have attributed. So then the question is, well, if it wasn't a huge issue like slavery, and if it wasn't a series of really big traumas that sort of put people threw their psyches up in the air and allowed them to come down in some kind of disordered way that made them want to support fascism and lies and its rage, I think those are the two big components, the lies and the rage, and how the rage is connected with acting destructively and making the human world worse, which is a hallmark of what a force of brokenness or evil might do. But if that's not the case, what I think is distinctive in this situation is actually that the primary force has been a force of propaganda, that there was a lot of money available to hand out to people on a regular basis, like Limbaugh 3 hours a day, and eventually like Fox News around the clock. The kinds of messages that would achieve the transformation without the huge issue or without the traumas. It's just a way of, you can teach people if you've got 20 plus, whatever it is, 30 years to teach them. The propagandists set the stage where a Republican base that I think back in Reagan's era would have rejected Donald Trump immediately, would embrace a Donald Trump. So that's what I think has been the prime mover. And again, it gives me that, and I don't understand well enough exactly how that got achieved or where those people are. If they're intelligent but don't apply their intelligence, if they're good people, which I find is the case when I deal with a lot of these people who are my neighbors and I do business with, and I feel that I can see the beauty in them that I saw in the 1990s. But when they enter the political realm, they're in this completely different place. That the propagandists, rather than, since I don't understand exactly where they are, I'm not sure what it would look like to bring them back to the better angels of their nature, where they really will bring their Christian values to guide their behavior in the political realm, which is not the case now, I can tell you. And bring their reverence for the Constitution into how the side that they pick when they vote. And that recognizes, again, the importance of good character and not become devotees of this ugly character that's like a display of the major character defects to which any human being might be embodied. I just do what I can, and that's always the last line. I do what I can. All right, I'd like to move now from that present day aspect of things here in America, where we're looking at what's happened to the Supreme Court, and we're looking at what has happened to tens of millions of our fellow Americans that are leading to, that are relevant to the question of whether American democracy is going to survive in the political battles that are to be fought in the American political arena in the coming months and years. And now to look at the larger picture, which is really the one in which I think is my best contribution to the real thing that motivates me is that I think I can show something about our situation as a species that's important and it could have a beneficial impact. And last time out, I laid out the idea that in that book of mine, The Parable of the Tribes, the problem of power in social evolution, I laid it out in a series of steps that I claim demonstrates that there is something that inevitably gets unleashed when a creature takes the step that our species took 10 or so thousand years ago, unprecedented in the history of life, a history that's 3.5 billion years, and we only are 10,000 years since we became the first species to take the fateful step, which is one of the things phrases I use, the fateful step of inventing our way of life and extricating ourselves from the niche in which we evolved biologically. And I claim that I can show that any species that takes that step will unleash a destructive force. It's not a function of its own nature. It's a systemic force. It's a function of having left the natural order that had ordered life as it evolved biologically through natural selection. By extricating itself from that order, it unleashes a disorder, which that disorder, I show, feeds a social evolutionary process that dictates big deal things about how civilization will develop in ways that people would never have chosen. Selection for the ways of power. And I claim that I can show that what I can show is inevitable to have happen, that the ugliness we see in human history of what we are, and we are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be. I claim that I can prove that. And moreover, I prove it by showing that there inevitably will emerge with any creature on any planet that takes that step onto the path of civilization, there will emerge a destructive force that has to be brought under control, and that we haven't yet brought under control. And by the way, the battle in this coming election in the United States, the leader of the free world, between fascism and American democracy, is one of history's showdowns. It's not the only one, but it's the one we got right now, and it is a big deal about what are the prospects for humankind. Whether we will order our civilization well enough and soon enough to be able to survive for the long haul, rather than destroy ourselves. Because that destructive force that inevitably emerges moves through the human system over the millennia, the centuries, the generations, inevitably. And until it's brought under control, it threatens that it will lead to the ultimate act of self-destruction. And that's a challenge that we face to order our civilization. So here's a piece that I wrote that was published on Three Quarks Daily. And this was my lead-off piece. The piece I read last time, which I called "The Ugliness We See in Human History Is Not Human Nature Writ Large." That I used second. I'm not sure I remember all the reasons why I did, but I think the reason is that idea asks people to think about civilization in a different way from what we're used to, because we take it for granted that the world is dominated by a human civilization. That shouldn't be taken for granted. That's an extraordinary development, and we need to look at the point at which that begins to understand the dynamic that was going to govern how it was going to unfold. But I don't think people think about civilization, they take it for granted. So here I am, instead not looking back to the world before civilization, and therefore focusing on what are the consequences of taking that fateful step, but looking ahead, because I think we all, to some extent, live in the present and also have some awareness that history's moving on, and there's some question about how it's going to be. I mean, if you look at the movies that we see that depict the future, and I've never written about this to my satisfaction, but the picture of the future that we see in, I don't know, Mad Max and Blade Runner and they're almost all dystopian. They're almost all pictures of the world either dehumanized and sterile and maybe tyrannical, or there's been a complete breakdown and like the Mad Max world. Um, what's that word? That Coleman, that McCarthy. Oh, anyway, we have a lot of dystopian fantasies about the future, and we don't have visions of a more benign human future. Now, I've written about happy endings and how we want to see challenges met. We don't want to just immediately have a hero that's got everything, and we want a happy ending that we get to through all kinds of obstacles and setbacks. That is fulfilling to us. We don't want to watch somebody that's got it all. But I don't think we actually even have movies about how a human world that starts with a lot of ugliness gets to something better. Well, in a way, the Star Wars movies, and in a way, Avatar, and in a way, the Lord of the Rings movies are all about good defeating evil. We go through the pain of watching evil having great force so that they can destroy a whole planet. And Obi-Wan Kenobi, I feel a disturbance in the force, and they can destroy much of the planet that's being plundered for unobtainium in Avatar, and that threatens to have all these ugly figures overrun the shires and all that of the good human world. But it's just a happy ending at the end, and but that is what we need. It is what we need. How do we get, what's it going to look like to get from here to there? Not to the Mad Max breakdown, not to the sterile world. I can't think of examples at the moment, but I think a lot about the fate of human civilization these days. The subject worries me because after a half century of studying the destructive forces at work in the systems of civilization, my gut feeling is that it is no better than a toss-up whether in the coming generations or couple centuries, humankind will get its act together well enough to prevent our civilization from destroying itself. Or if not destroy itself utterly, at least inflict profoundly catastrophic damage through some catastrophic nuclear war or through some ruinous degradation of the systems of life on Earth, on which we inevitably depend for our own wholeness of life. And I worry because it doesn't seem that humankind, taken as a whole, is giving this uncertainty about the human future, which could hardly be more consequential, nearly the kind of attention it deserves. It deserves when so much of what we hold sacred is under serious threat, from human well-being to the beauties of this living planet, to our aspirations for a human world ruled by justice and the spirit of peace on earth and goodwill toward men. Upon reflection, that deficiency of attention is not so surprising. Our history had no reason to equip us to a depth commensurate with the stakes, with the capacity to connect our minds and our motivational core with this kind of challenge. Here, I'm talking about that muddle through thing I mentioned earlier that we've had before, but we don't have now. The newly visible challenge. The history to which we are heirs includes many millennia in which the possibility of our global self-destruction simply did not exist. By contrast, it is only within the span of living memory that humankind has come to possess the power of that magnitude. Only recently has this question of the fate of civilization gained that kind of urgency. It was only in World War II that the breakthrough achieved by the Manhattan Project opened the door to the possibility that life on Earth's experiment with civilization might culminate in a nuclear holocaust. That possibility already came dangerously close to realization in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we've been compelled lately to re-envision that potential nightmare when one man, who is an unbalanced fascist dictator, filled with resentments and a lust for empire, and in command of a massive nuclear arsenal, rattled his nuclear saber to intimidate his opponents. And the second threat to our survival, it is still more recently that we've discovered ourselves to have become such a big bull in the biospheric china shop that we might self-destruct, through the disastrous damage we inflict on the systems of life on Earth. Systems out of which we emerged and on which we inevitably depend for our survival. And I say that the oncoming climate disruption crisis might prove to be just this kind of cataclysm. I'm expressing there my uncertainty about just how big a catastrophe we're on our way to. And I've made some effort to learn, and I don't think it's visible yet, but I think that we're still in the early stage of something that's already looking pretty big and only sure to get a lot bigger. So the urgency with which the fate of human civilization needs to be addressed is only a recent thing in the historical scale. And meanwhile, our long-established cultural ways of thinking likely have not caught up with the major changes of circumstances brought about by the magnification of the powers of our civilization. That book back there, The Parable of Tribes, got me interest from Harper Publishers for my next book, and they wanted me to. I proposed that I write a book called In Over Our Heads, which is, about our long-established cultural ways of thinking have likely not caught up. And I was going to develop that idea about the ways we need to change our thinking to be able to grasp the nature of the challenge that we face and address it more productively. But then I got hit by a spiritually transformative experience that led to my having to tell Harper that I feel called to write about this. What did I do? I feel compelled to write about this this thing I've seen. It's the book was called Out of. I ended up writing, and it was published not by Harper. They wanted In Over Our Heads. They didn't want this book, which I felt called to write, which is about the psychological and spiritual dimensions of what gets broken in the human world because of the release of that destructive force I described in The Parable of Tribes, the inevitable war of all against all, and the selection for power and all the traumas that brings about, and how we need to heal ourselves. That was where I was at, and Bantam signed that book, and they published it in 1988, and it came out. It was nicely published. So that's the idea that we are called upon because of the powers that we have gained to change our consciousness in certain ways. Some of them having to do with our intellectual understanding of the systems within which we're operating, which is what I probably would have done with In Over Our Heads. but part of it also having to do with healing ourselves psychologically and spiritually, healing the wounds that drive us to war. Um, if you look at fascism, for example, being driven to war is really a quite manifest part of the pattern. It's not for nothing that our most huge fascist figure, Adolf Hitler, plunged the world into a World War II. And it's not coincidence that when we get another major fascist figure in Vladimir Putin, his role in the world order is to reintroduce the power of war and conflict in the European region, where people had worked for generations to develop a more peaceful, cooperative order. And it's not for nothing that the fascist force that's taken over a large part of the American political power system, and one of America's two main parties, is one that has basically a conflictual relationship with just about everybody who's not them. Whether it's their relationship with black people or with immigrants, or with calling Mexicans rapists, or blocking Muslims, or people who are not sexually like the majority, or their idea about how to see and how to deal with people who are liberals, how to deal with Democrats with whom they share power, the power that the people gave them in Congress. It's all about conflict. So healing the wounds that drive us to war is not really irrelevant to healing the forces at work in our world. I mean, if we had a world in which peace on earth and goodwill toward men, if that's all you needed to change was that people brought to one another the desire for cooperation and not conflict, and some degree of goodwill toward other people, those are the two messages that accompany the birth of Jesus, for example. If all you changed was that that's how people operated, I think a lot would follow. But okay, let's go on. But things are different now. We've moved beyond more of the same in our powers. Massive nuclear powers are not like the Roman Empire or the British Empire in terms of the potential for destroying the planet. And expecting to be able to continue to muddle through is dangerously fallacious. As the powers of human civilization have grown, counting on muddling through, as opposed to undertaking necessary transformations of civilization to block the forces of destruction, has become a recipe for disaster. For example, leaving the international order as it has always been, which means that confrontations between great nuclear powers, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, will recur indefinitely. And leaving the international order that way amounts to playing Russian roulette. One of these days, Alice, one of these days, we know for a virtual certainty what would be the outcome for a person who keeps on spinning the chamber and pulling the trigger. Eventually, what can happen will happen. Civilization, with its persisting war system, which the parable of tribes shows inevitably arose, not because of human nature, but because of a systemic dynamic, once you leave the natural order, won't survive for the long haul if we just keep on playing this kind of Russian roulette. The long-term survival of human civilization, therefore, clearly requires that we eventually, in time, achieve some reordering transformations of the overarching system of civilized societies. Humankind reached in that general direction after both of the two terrible world wars of the 20th century. After World War I, humankind reached for that in forming the League of Nations. It's supposed to be the war to end all wars. Have a code that would be followed. Of course, then came World War II, and out of World War II, FDR, well, I think, was the main spearhead in making sure that the United Nations emerged out of that global conflict. But the subsequent history has demonstrated clearly that such efforts have fallen far short of what the prevention of all-out war between major nuclear superpowers requires. In the parable of the tribes, the addition that exists still in print, not for, I mean, it got turned off somehow. The world rallied to put Saddam Hussein back behind his borders. I wanted them to overturn that regime. Maybe I was wrong. I was disappointed. There was something a little bit off about how Bush led the Shia of Iraq on and then left them dangling to face Saddam unprotected. But in addition, I thought that the proper punishment involved more than you get to rule Iraq still. The way his son ended up botching the invasion of Iraq, maybe I was mistaken. Maybe the first Bush was smart in saying, well, we're going to do what we did to the Iraqi forces, so that there are these burning tanks on the deserts leading to Kuwait, and they've been utterly defeated. And maybe that's enough, and we weren't going to take on the nation building that we would have to take on if we occupied Iraq. I mean, I was born in 1946, and I'm semi-aware of things bigger than East Lansing, Michigan, where I had my boyhood. When we were just sort of ending our important role as occupying powers in Japan and Germany in the wake of World War II. And I had this idea that it can be done. I mean, Japan as it existed, as I started becoming aware of, the Japan that had used to be ruled by this ugly fascist regime that conducted this slaughter of Nanking back in 1930 and was so cruel to so many people. It's become a much more decent society. It can be done. And the Germany that had been, Sieg Heiling and Heil Hitlering for 12 years could become, by the time Konrad Adenauer represents the West German power anyway. It can be done. So I believed in that possibility that, we haven't done so well since then. Afghanistan, Iraq, I don't know if it could have been done by the first Bush. He would have had the sense his son did not, to know what's required for it to be successful. I mean, because some people knew things that Dick Cheney ignored because he knew better. I know that's getting off on a tangent, but I want you to know I pay attention to these things. There's a book called Fiasco about how that was botched. So what was possible, I don't know. But anyway, we had a chance to establish rules about how the world order is going to be. How do we get from here to there so there's never going to be a Cuban Missile Crisis again? That might be Russian roulette of humankind blowing itself and the planet up. Well, this was an opportunity to establish that rule, that Saddam Hussein had done something that will not be tolerated in a third-rate power. Even though we're not prepared to keep the United States or Russia or China, the really big powers, we can't control them, but we can, that might be in the future. How we get from here to there, well, we got to figure that out. This is not easy. Becoming a civilization-creating creature inevitably entails a huge challenge, which we have not yet met. And if we don't meet it, we're going to destroy ourselves. By the way, it wasn't much later that the world order that was coming into being in the wake of the Cold War. The Cold War had frozen the ability to sort of create something coherent because the world was split into these conflicting superpowers. But the end of the Cold War opened the possibility of we might make some collective decisions about how this world is going to evolve so we don't destroy ourselves. Well, there was something emerging out of the former Yugoslavia, as they used to call it. And at first it involved Not the Bosnians. I don't remember the scenario quite on a really accurate timeline. But the first thing, I know it's got to do with the shelling of Dubrovnik. The Serbs went after Croatia. I mean, Serbia and Croatia were both parts of Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia had been sort of patched together under a fellow named Tito, a communist, but not one that did obeisance to Moscow. After World War II, they were partisans against the Nazis. Anyway, but I wouldn't want to have to write a blue book right now about why did this. Well, Tito died eventually. And I guess maybe he held the whole thing together, but anyway, it broke apart. And suddenly you've got this fascistic regime governing Serbia. And like fascistic regimes, it wasn't going to be in a kind of goodwill toward men healing the wounds that drive us to war kind of frame of mind. It was going to become an aggressive nation. Eventually, it led to aggressiveness to the point where, what is it, 6,000 men and boys slaughtered and burned and buried in a field by Srebrenica, Muslim Bosnians, and camps set up so that Bosnian women would be repeatedly raped in concentration camps by Serbian men. But it began with some kind of aggression against Croatia. And there was this shelling of Dubrovnik. And I was watching to see how the world would react to this thing. And it was disappointing. And I got another piece into the Christian Science Monitor. And I said, well, apparently, this talk about a new kind of world order that President Bush the first was talking about was a fig leaf over the great powers protecting their own interests, because the interests of the United States in something like Kuwait, which is a big oil producing, even if it's a tiny country, that region of the world is a place where we, at that time, more than today, were very dependent for the lifeblood of our economy. And American policy in the Middle East had a lot to do with the importance of protecting our access to oil. So I say in that piece, in a somewhat disappointed piece, now here I am being, overly optimistic again. I mean, I don't know if I was saying this is how it's going to be, but my practice has always been envision where we might go and then talk about, what are our opportunities to move in that direction? So I wanted Kuwait to be a new set of rules, but I said, apparently, if Kuwait's national product had been all about growing broccoli, there wouldn't have been talk about a new world order. There wouldn't have been amassing this very impressive coalition of the willing. Was that back then? That Bush did, masterful diplomacy by an American president, really impressive. But when it came to Dubrovnik getting shelled, this aggression did not stand. So instead of the new world order that I was hoping for, where there would be new rules about that would control power. I mean, that book back there says the problem of power and social evolution. You don't want the weaker to always have to become the victims of the strong. And that's what was happening in Yugoslavia, and that was what was happening when Saddam invaded Kuwait, but only the oil producer inspired this New World Order talk. So when I wrote the post-Cold War afterward to the Parable of Tribes about the problem of power, I said, basically, I haven't read it for a while. We had an opportunity there, and we missed it. wanting the world to take the path that it should sets you up for a certain amount of disappointment. So going back to the fate of human civilization and the question of are we going to be able to order our civilization well enough and soon enough to survive on this planet? And if we keep on playing Russian roulette, have enough disorder in the internet societal system that envelops human civilization that we could blow ourselves up. Eventually, Russian roulette results in death. What can happen will happen. And this climate crisis demonstrates the need for important transformations. Changes to harmonize civilization's activities with the needs of the rest of life on Earth. We can only hope that it's not already too late. As muddling through disappears as an option, in other words, because we become so powerful, we can destroy ourselves, and will if we don't change how things work. The possibilities get increasingly dichotomous, either thrive or die. As our civilization works its way into the future, the question is, will it be the constructive forces or the destructive forces that prevail? The constructive forces were the ones that it seemed like were maybe becoming visible in the wake of the Cold War, when the world rallied to say, no, this kind of aggression will not stand. That's the constructive forces. And I've already articulated the challenge, but I want to articulate it here again. And let me also say that there's a step-by-step aspect to this, like there was of the previous one. And I may break this down. You can go find this on my YouTube library, and you can also find this piece, whose link I should provide in the, if you want to read this, so that you can take it as step by step at your own pace, because there are a variety of things that need to be sort of digested and accepted to lead to the conclusions that I'm heading toward in this piece. The challenge that we face, and that any civilization creating species would have to face, is to order its civilization well enough and soon enough that it can prevent the story, in this case of the human species, but anywhere else of that species, from culminating in catastrophe. Facing that challenge is an inevitable part of becoming a civilization-creating creature. But in retrospect, it becomes clear that this challenge has been looming in the human future from the beginnings of our species' venture onto the path of civilization. It becomes clear, but only in retrospect. I mean, it's not like I expected the people who were embarking on this path to see it. We've reached a point where the evidence shows it to be true. To get to see how it's inevitable that any species that steps onto the path of civilization is going to have to meet that challenge, it's good to have a definition of this definition of what I mean by civilization. Those societies created by a creature that extricates itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically by inventing its own way of life. That definition, which calls attention to the unprecedented nature of this development in the history of life's evolution on this or any other planet, suggests how those two kinds of self-destructive possibilities we face today were implied from the outset. those two destructive possibilities are like that eventually you get to the point where warfare can destroy that species' civilization. And eventually you'll get to the point where that species' destructive impact on the biologically evolved order might become so great that the survival of that civilization would be at least, seriously jeopardized. Inevitably, the unprecedented step of the civilizing animal that extricates itself from the biologically evolved order will mean that the civilizing societies will emerge into a situation that lacks any order to regulate the interactions among those societies. And let me also intend to put on the description the step-by-step way in which I demonstrate both that inevitability and the inevitable consequences of that inevitability. There will be inevitably a war of all against all. No order, because this unprecedented kind of life form, and I'm saying that a civilized society differs from every other previous form of life on this planet or any other planet, in that it's not the fruit of DNA being selected by natural selection in the biological process, but is the fruit of being invented out of the creative intelligence of the creature. That takes life into, I use the phrase here, terra incognita, like uncharted territory, where no regulatory system awaits it. In other words, there's nothing in biological evolution. Again, that's what I talked about before. That creates orders that make sure that the interactions among the actors are, the overarching system is ordered, even if they're killing each other. It's part of the overarching order that maintains the synergy and the viability of the whole thing. But when you escape from that, you enter inevitably into a disorder called anarchy. Anarchy is one in which each actor can do whatever it wants. There's no order that constrains it, that compels it to do something that's good for the whole. There's nothing to make sure that its actions will be compatible with the good of the overarching system. The English philosopher Thomas Hobbes had a fundamental and valid insight about anarchy. It inevitably entails a war of all against all. And that means that with the rise of civilization, there inevitably emerges the problem of war, which plagued the ancient world and has persisted throughout the history of human civilization till reaching the point where in our times it now has the potential to set the whole edifice of human civilization up in flames. So that's one of the ways we might destroy ourselves, that inevitably has to do with a disorder that there is in the inherent to the rise of civilization. So also with our relationship with the ecological order. The creature that extricates itself from its original place in the natural order, inventing new ways of living on this planet, as the original primate way of hunting and gathering gave way to people's growing the foods that they used to gather and herding the animals they used to hunt. And onward from there to utilizing other technologies that never had to pass muster with the long-term selective process of biological evolution. Like the rise of agriculture and the development of irrigation systems that over time will leave the earth salted, for example. And technologies like herding, which have, in some situations, the process of completely undermining the ecosystem and spreading deserts where there used to be the means to support animal populations. The creature that's extricated itself from that original place in the natural order is sure from the beginning to generate some, to be out of harmony in some ways with the rest of the ecological order. And so the historical record reveals how early agricultural societies denuded the topsoil of the once fertile crescent, and how overgrazing by the herds of civilizing people led the Sahara Desert to spread and eventually onward, with civilization employing new and powerful technologies made possible by the scientific and industrial revolutions, to the point that our industrial civilization has so changed the composition of the Earth's atmosphere and thus so disrupted the Earth's climate system that we are precipitating a major wave of extinctions. A book called The Sixth Extinction lays that all out. I can't remember the author's name. And we are ripping the fabric of life on Earth. So it is that both of those two areas, in which in our times visibly threaten the survival of human civilization, and where we clearly need to order our civilization well enough and soon enough, appear to be inevitable areas of disorder from the time civilization first arose. And here I want to say more about why it's inevitable. It's not only inevitable because, as I think I just argued, that the initial consequences of the emergence of civilization are both to make a war a chronic problem, and to make our ecological imprint a chronic threat to the integrity of the various wholes that constitute the biosphere and various ecosystems. But it's also inevitable for another reason. And again, I'm going to provide links to this piece where you can read it at your own pace, and so that each point that's made gets a chance if it's needed. I don't know. I don't know what's needed. I mean, I've been working on these ideas for so long. I just don't know. But if this exceeds the ability, then I suggest that you find where this is available in a recorded form, and I should put that on the description here too, available on a recorded form so they can be heard in various sittings, and also to the piece where I labored to lay this out in words in a systematic way without these diversions and digressions that I hope to add something to it, to beyond what's what I laid out when I was posting this on not Daily Cost, Three Quarks Daily, as the initial piece of the better human story that I feel driven to try to get out there. Both of these two powers will grow because a creature that starts to invent its own way of life and thereby breaks out of the bounds that previously limited its range of cultural possibilities, regarding, for example, the size, social organization, and means of subsistence of its societies, will now have open-ended possibilities for cultural innovation. And by the way, that's part of the inevitability of the selection for the ways of power that I described in that book and in the previous long live stream. Nor only will the cultural breakthroughs presumably, not only will they keep coming, but also because the creature is of necessity a cultural animal, which means it is adept at transmitting information through the generations. The process of cultural development will tend to be cumulative. These two factors, the open-ended possibilities and the ability to keep on accumulating through time, combine to dictate that over the course of its history, the powers being wielded by that civilization, powers that include civilization's destructive capabilities, will tend continually to increase. Tend, because although the history of that species civilization will likely have its ups and downs, its rises and falls, the overall direction will be toward Rome may have fallen, and the resulting retrogression of the power of in European civilization was only temporary. Eventually, European civilization emerges in a more powerful mode than anything Rome ever fielded, with its industrialization and its gunboats and such. And powers can be used either constructively or destructively. Therefore, I like to claim some inevitabilities in laying out these things. It seems a reasonably safe bet that any creature on any planet that accomplishes the breakthrough into civilization will eventually, as this tendency to become ever more powerful, both ecologically in its impact and in terms of the weapons of war that it wields, bring the creature's story to a catastrophe, will come to possess powers great enough that they could, if they were wielded destructively, like a nuclear holocaust or, climate catastrophe, bring the creature's story to a catastrophic ending. Therefore, the emergence of civilization will inevitably lead to a creature having to order its civilization and prevent the destructive forces from becoming the means of its semi-complete undoing. Which leads me to a fantasy I've lately entertained. It might be titled The Findings of the Cosmic Historian. I like to imagine a cosmic historian or social historian who is contemplating the histories of the many species, I'm postulating, who developed civilizations on various planets in the Milky Way, or if that doesn't give you a big enough sample, various planets in any of the other billions of galaxies. Some population of species that develop civilization that I'm postulating without knowing. There must be out there, so many. I imagine no shortage of cases to study. With the estimated 6 billion planets in our galaxy alone, and with billions of galaxies, it seems reasonable to assume that there'll be plenty enough instances of species emerging out of the evolving systems of life on their various planets that have the creative intelligence to invent their own way of life and thereby to extricate themselves from the niche in which they evolved, meaning to develop, take the step onto the path of civilization, which I say has inevitable consequences, creates a destructive force that eventually becomes powerful enough as the species in civilization becomes powerful enough that it might result in destruction of that civilization if they don't order their civilization well enough, soon enough. The cosmic historian undertakes a research project to answer the question. I have some training about, the collection of empirical evidence involving case studies, et cetera, et cetera. So this would be one of them things. What are the factors that most differentiate those civilizations that survived and thrived, got past their self-destruction danger, from those that ended in catastrophe? I'm imagining this cosmic historian will divide these histories into two stacks. Those of the creatures, the stories of the creatures whose civilizations rose beautifully to meet the challenge. And in the other stack, those that just blew it. And I'm imagining the heights of the two stacks will be roughly of the same order of magnitude, or at least close enough for a good comparative study. But I'm inferring roughly. If I've said that I think it's a toss-up whether we're going to make it or not. I don't know if that's very accurate. And I'm also postulating, as I think I could do here, that we human beings here in 2024, how we've been doing with this challenge over the centuries and right now, is more or less typical. I don't know, of course, if that's true. I mean, we may be laggards in this competition or in this, this event. Maybe we're doing rather well, or maybe we're doing especially poorly. But I'm imagining us to be more or less typical, because if it's a toss-up and we're typical, the two stacks, the failures and success should be in not that far from being in balance. But you could still do the study, even if most of them failed or if most of them succeeded. You could still, if you had enough cases of the one that was a minority, whichever one it was, you could do a comparative study. But anyway, let's see what I said here. This was back in 2022. I wrote this thing. That rough equality would follow if that toss-up thing, the toss-up thing that the outcome in the case of Homo sapiens, it is a toss-up, and then secondly that we're more or less typical in our capacities to rise to the challenge. Typical of the various other creatures elsewhere in the cosmos that have taken that fateful step onto the path of civilization. Because I see no reason to guess otherwise. So I don't say that's true. I'm just saying I'm postulating it. Out of a plethora of toss-ups, there would be roughly comparable numbers of successes and failures. But again, we don't need comparable numbers. We just need to be able to get with ample numbers of cases of both failure and successes. However, that we dredge those samples up. I imagine our investigator of civilizational dynamic doing in-depth case studies, as well as some statistical analyses, and then presenting these among the study's main findings. And this is pure conjecture from your host. Those civilizations were more likely to survive the more and the sooner those creatures recognized the nature of the challenge that they faced. I would say one way of putting that would be that they recognize what I'm trying to show in my Better Human story. The nature of the forces at work and the need to bring the destructive forces that inevitably emerge with civilization under control well enough and soon enough. Okay, next bullet point. The study's main findings. The second one, they were more likely to survive too, the more and the sooner they made deliberate efforts to meet that big long-term challenge. In other words, they weren't just focused on how do we deal with the momentary. They were asking themselves, what do we need to accomplish in the, basically as expeditiously as can prudently be done, because we already have demonstrably the power to destroy ourselves. So focus on that question. Where do we need to get to? Conversely, the longer of civilization essentially backed into the future, dealing with only the immediate problems and leaving the longer term future to define itself, the more likely that civilization would end up in ruins. So those 3 points, recognizing the challenge, making real efforts, not backing into the future, are all sort of underlying purposes of my effort to get this better human story out there, because it claims to clarify where we're at and what we got to do. I mean, when we say got to do, if protecting the human good and justice and the thriving of life on Earth and the fulfillment of humankind, and if that isn't worth doing, what is? I mean, really. So I don't. I make claims that I think are well founded and that put me in the position of having to do everything I can to get this thing out there. For which making claims is part of the strategy, but I do not claim to have anything like a roadmap. I mean, I talked before about how I thought the Kuwait situation was an opportunity to establish certain things that, that then there was another opportunity to confirm when the Serbs started shelling Dubrovnik, but we had not made that kind of progress. But I think that I can offer, in the absence of a roadmap, I think I can offer a meta starting place that is a lot better than nothing. It focuses the attention on how to get a roadmap. Okay, so I had that fantasy about the cosmic historian who divided the civilizations up to the ones that thrived eventually, that made it for the long term, and then the ones that destroyed itself. And I said, you got to really focus your attention on meeting that challenge, because destroying yourself is a genuine possibility, and it's really not what you want the whole story to end up with, because everything that matters is at stake. Everything that anybody would call sacred eventually ends up being at stake. And even in just looking at the American conflict of today, if you look at you bring into sharp focus what's at stake in the political battle in these times, when it boils down to democracy versus fascism, everything that we might, I think, argue is really at stake, the values that would be lost if the wrong forces take over, everything that we might call sacred is at stake. So returning from this fantasy, I am led to make these 2 straightforward opening proposals regarding what humankind should do now, should do as collectively as possible, despite our still fragmented civilization, to increase the chances that human civilization might thrive for the long haul on this planet and not terminate itself through self-inflicted wounds. The first task is that we should work to envision the desired destination. Focus attention on the question, what way of organizing human civilization would maximize the chances of its long-term survival? I got thoughts about that. A lot of people have had thoughts about how to deal with the problem of war. A lot of those thoughts are good ones. A lot of people have had thoughts about how to have a sustainable global economy so that we don't bring the biosphere down on our heads. A lot of good thoughts. We need to work to play a fairly important role in our lives as a civilization, not so marginal as it is now in terms of, utopian visions and such, but a real serious work on this is what it would ideally look like if we had a planet where nuclear war wasn't possible and environmental catastrophe was out of the question, or as far in that direction as we could get. Which, to repeat a little bit of what I just said, but reading here. That question should, of course, include addressing these two obvious dimensions of the challenge. What order would be best for precluding the possibility, completely if possible, or to the maximal degree possible if complete isn't possible, I don't know, of self-destruction through war? What we got going on with Ukraine and nuclear-armed Putin, and what we got going on with the tensions between China, Taiwan, and the United States over China's designs to potentially use force to bring Taiwan within China's domination where they think it belongs. It's obviously we have not arrived at the desired destination. What would it look like if we did? We should think a lot about that. Not in a naive way, but in a what is required of us way, soon enough, well enough. Likewise, with the second potential way, we should ask, what steps would it be wise to take now that will help us reach this destination? I thought I was going to be talking about the environmental thing. These are the second, the desired destination gets rid of the possibilities of a nuclear holocaust, and it also gets rid of the possibility that we bring the ecosphere into such catastrophic condition that human civilization basically fails that way. So there are two questions. How do we envision what civilization would look like when we've minimized the chances that we'll destroy ourselves? That's off into the future, however far that has to be. I don't know how far. I would guess certainly generations. We don't change easily. But then the second question is, what steps would be wise to take now that will help us reach that destination? In other words, to use that envisioned destination for practical purposes. That one's utopian, but not necessarily impossible. We're not trying to envision a destination that, that's absolutely why even talk about it? By the way, it comes into handy in that respect that I can prove that we are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be. That the ugliness we see has to be understood differently because of that idea that I presented before. So what's realistic should be expanded. I mean, we still can't achieve the impossible, but our sense of what we're capable of should be improved at least some. Because the ugliness that we see in the world around us can be explained without regard to human nature, I claim to prove. These are discussions. I'm talking about a conversation to happen, within countries, within organizations of countries like the EU, like NATO, And with it, and in whatever global ways we have of doing it, to enlist all the major players and minor players that can be enlisted in having this conversation. Not an easy thing to do. Uh, I mean, what the Chinese want and what the Russians want, um, but whatever we can do is what we to create the best possible conversation at in the best possible ways. You can have meetings of, the Aspen Institute at one level. You can have things happening in the United Nations at one level. You can have bilateral negotiations. Whatever level you can be, there got to be conversations, and people are going to envision the desired destination differently. And there will be different ideas about what steps would be best for reaching it. That's part of the challenge, but it's not exactly a problem. The ongoing conversation around these differences would be an important part of the solution. It's part of the challenge to create whatever kinds of civilizations will help us to move in the directions that we need to move. Humankind, to survive on this planet for the long haul with our civilization, needs to find its way together. So whatever our differences, well, that's just part of what we got to deal with. The important thing is that more attention be paid to that long-term challenge, envisioning our destination, taking steps, best design to get us there. It is true, of course, that we, individually, nationally, globally, need to deal with our immediate problems. But with the survival of human civilization, perhaps hinging on the equivalent of a coin toss, we cannot afford to spend as little time as we currently do thinking about what civilization needs to become to assure its long-term survival. Backing into the future likely means having no future. That's what my hypothetical cosmic historian hypothetically would have found, that if we don't recognize that we are at a particular point in the evolution of civilization on this planet where we've got a certain level of power, where we've got certain levels of understanding, and where certain kinds of challenge have become visible to us, all more than was true before. We need to up our game. And because I think that the better human story that I've been putting together for more than half a century provides some way of understanding where we're at, why we're at this point, what needs to be accomplished, and why, and how, just a bit of how. That's why I feel driven to try to get people to pay attention to this integrative vision of the story of our species. It's a story whose future we're in the process of writing. For example, they talk about alternative universes. I don't believe in that. My mind, I don't like for my mind to be too boggled. There are different universes where everything that could happen. But if we imagine like we're in what's that movie? It's a Wonderful Life, where we envision the town that becomes so ugly and mean-spirited in the absence of Jimmy Stewart, and then it's sort of this lovely town, Bedford Falls, when Jimmy Stewart has played the role he has. If we look at the two possible human futures that ensue from, say, the election of 2024 in the United States, who knows what's going to happen? But I think that even though you never know how the future is going to unfold. There are many dynamics at work, and they work in mysterious ways, the history to unfold. Nonetheless, based on what reasonably can be understood, if the election goes in the direction of the United States of America, aligns itself with fascism and climate denial and a lot of ugly stuff, that it completely abdicates, as we saw from 2017 to 2021. Already it was visible that we abdicated the role of the leader of the free world, which I don't want to be naive and say, well, we have always been the good guys, in America. The America that's been a constitutional democracy has always been the leader of the free world. But if you look at the struggles we've been engaged in, against the fascist powers of Germany and Japan and in World War II, and then against the totalitarian Stalinist regime and what derived from it during the Cold War, we may not be as much the good guys as it gives me pleasure to think, but we've always been a whole lot more the better guys. People were not marching by, voting with their feet to go from West Germany to East Germany during the Cold War. It was in the other direction. It was clear which one was better for the human world. Those feet were voting for the democratic will of the people, rule of law, rather than a tyrannical suppression of human rights, reliance on force, top-down system. If the United States becomes aligned with Putin's Russia, that leads to one way that history can unfold. Not that we know what it would be, but it is really, really justified to believe that if the United States stays on the side of the rule of law domestically, on the side of democracy globally, on the side of punishing fascist aggression in terms of the kind of world order we got, it's not hard to see which is the better path. So we operate in a world where we make choices that determine what the future of our species on this planet will be. And that future is a whole lot better if we choose the options that are obviously a whole lot better. By the way, I have definitions of good and evil that are actually operate, I think, quite well in a social scientific as well as moral philosophy kind of a way. And when you look at the implications of democracy and the implications of fascism, and you lay them out over my definitions of good and evil, which have to do with coherent forces that consistently work to drive the world in the direction of greater wholeness or greater brokenness, and I think those definitions work. The choice between democracy and fascism really maps very well parallel to what is a meaningful definition of two forces that are reasonable to call good versus evil. So, last section here, I think. The beneficial effects of knowing what we are up against. That's the title of that book. I've been trying, well, there was a decade starting with Rush Limbaugh and then Newt Gingrich and then Fox News, where I was sort of through a glass darkly aware of something going on. And then starting in 2004, it became clear and important that there was such a thing as a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world worse, and that it can be described and shown. How well such important conversations about where we need to get to and how humankind can get from here to there might achieve their goals depends on how well the discussants understand, as the title of my 2015 book put it, what we're up against. Subtitle, The Destructive Force at Work in Our World and How We Can Defeat It. Which is part of how I think that there's an integrative vision to be had of the forces at work in our world that will increase our understanding of what needs to be done. Humankind needs to understand, in other words, the forces operating in the human world that have historically driven humankind in directions people have not wanted, that book, The Parable of Tribes, and that are now visibly working to impede human civilizations moving in those directions that would enable it to survive for the long haul. The attempt to understand those forces has been my life's work. In a series of subsequent entries, this was a series that I published on Three Quarks Daily, each standalone and each contributing a piece to an integrated picture, I will offer what I've come up with. And then my next essay, I don't need to talk about that. That's one I did first. The idea about a force that inevitably rose with civilization, and independently of the nature of the civilization creating creature, a force that has consistently warped the evolution of civilization. It's a force that gives us this force of brokenness that's working in the world right now with the rise of fascism at the expense of democracy, not just in the United States. Ever since that idea first came to me in a life-changing moment in 1970, described in that book, and again, I'm going to put the link to the last live stream, where I go through 6 steps that lead, I think, to a compelling set of conclusions. I have believed that it could have a beneficial impact. A beneficial impact on our ability to choose the fate we desire for the civilization our species has been developing on this planet. If that idea can gain a widespread presence in the consciousness of our civilization, which is why it's important to get it out there. It's not like ideas change anything, no matter what they show. You know, there is I saw a biopic. I'm a big old movie buff, where Paul Muni plays Louis Pasteur, and there are all these years that go by when he is completely ostracized by the French scientific and medical establishments because he's offering this germ theory of, and they reject it as nonsense. It's only when he's able to persuade by means that are not, I don't think, available to me, because you can't conduct the experiment with 2 herds of sheep with the anthrax. It's only when he's been able to get that thinking out into the world that, things like women dying because doctors delivering their babies never washed their hands. The germ theory of it had to get out there before it saved all those lives. Yeah. So it has to get out there. I make these 2 claims, which I say that when I lay out that idea about what we're up against, once you see what we're up against and how it inevitably emerges because of, as an inevitable consequence of taking an unprecedented, fateful step out of the biological order, it inevitably follows that the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large. And I claim that, it follows that we are better creatures than we have claimed ourselves to be. And once we see ourselves as better creatures, I believe it's easy to envision how there would be a beneficial impact of that. I mentioned earlier that when we're talking about what steps to take to get to where we need to get to, if we have a sense of ourselves as being inherently more capable than the original sin crowd has been telling us, I think we're going to be more likely to envision what we need to envision and more likely to be able to take the steps to get there that we need to take. Okay. I believe that. And the second conclusion that is drawn from that idea, that when we understand that the fate of civilization, it basically hinges on whether we can bring a destructive force under control well enough and soon enough, that I claim that that idea shows that any species, that just taking the step onto the path of civilization will inevitably unleash a social evolutionary force that will make the unfolding of the civilization of any civilization creating species on any planet, anywhere in the cosmos, as destructive and tormented as ours has been. I claim to show that a conclusion of what it means to take that step out of the naturally evolved biological order into the disorder of inventing a new kind of life force, a life form, because it's not been shaped by biological evolution and natural selection. I claim that I can show that it doesn't matter what kind of a creature takes that step. That unprecedented situation leads to an unprecedented systemic dynamic that's where the whole generates a force that's not a consequence of the sum of the parts. And I've used the metaphor of people being trampled in one situation and not being trampled when they've learned fire drills. And it's not the different nature of the creature. It's got to do with the disorder of the system in this New York nightclub where 100 people got trampled to death. Not because they were tramplers, but because they were in a disordered situation. Whereas the school children having to deal with the fire, they've been taught how to march out. Well, we got to make our civilization more like school children that have been through a few fire drills and know how to behave. Less like the people getting trampled. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. And I've encountered many times how people don't think that way in situations where thinking that way is necessary for understanding what's going on. So the first statement means that we're better creatures that we have imagined ourselves to be, and that should fortify us for creating a more viable and humane civilization. It should lighten some of the burden under which we have labored in cultures in which ideas like original sin and human depravity have played a powerful role. Expectations are powerful. The second statement about any creature on any planet that takes that step points to the destructive dynamics that have been operating in human civilization for millennia. Dynamics, the understanding of which should enable humankind to devise better strategies for the ongoing battle over the fate of civilization. And then I do have another section which you might want to read, but I think I'll skip it because I've been bringing in the American situation right along, and there's a way of looking at the American situation, the crisis we face in America today, where we've got things that are very powerful, a whole major American political party that's behaving in ways that I would bet the farm that Americans of the generations that I was aware of growing up, like from the 40s, 50s. I mean, 40s I was less aware. I was born in 46. 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and then the beginnings of a certain degree of migration in a certain bad direction, which the other side of the political spectrum was blind and weak in dealing with. So this is a systemic thing. The force of fascism may have taken over one side of the American system where we're dealing with destructive forces. But I make the comparison of a compromised immune system. The virus of destructiveness or fascism or whatever took over one side of the American system. But there was an immune system that was supposed to respond to that rising virus in a way that the weakened immune system didn't mount the necessary measures. The fascistic force that was taking over the Republican Party was able to reap benefits from political behavior that it was the job of the Democratic Party and liberal America to make sure they would pay a political cost for. And so we're dealing with a systemic problem. The weakening of the immune system, the takeover of parts of the system by a destructive virus are part and parcel of the same picture. So I've been talking about the fate of human civilization. Also, I've been talking about the fate of the American democratic system. And the two are different levels of the same basic battle in the human system that's been going on since the rise of civilization and would inevitably go on with the rise of any creature's civilization, the unleashing of a destructive force, which I'm able to show. And I'll be back next time. Probably, I think I will show that discernible force so that you can see that the rise of this destructive force, social evolutionary destructive force, inevitably would create a pattern of a force moving brokenness through the human world over the generations, centuries, millennia, that bring us to places like where we are now. And also using the evolutionary perspective to show that there's a countervailing force. There are things inside us that are life-serving. They're there because they're life-serving. That's why things are in creatures that have evolved biologically. Those things being there gave their ancestors an advantage in getting their DNA into the future. And I can point to certain things that are in us because they were life-serving for our ancestors, which is why they're there, and that we can draw upon. Because inevitably, just as the disorder of civilization creates a force that we need to bring under control if the human world or whatever creature's world is to be whole and to be able to be viable for the long haul and lead to human fulfillment and not human degradation, et cetera, et cetera. We need to create empower the force of the better creatures that we are by nature, the better expectations that will fortify us for the ability, are more passionate, are plugging into the moral and spiritual passions that are have evolved in us as experiential tendencies and capacities because they were life-serving. We are not without resources from evolution to countervail against the destructive force that we unleashed when we departed from the biologically evolved order. And by tapping into them, we can change our human civilization into one in which those destructive forces that inevitably arose have much less power to shape the human world. And the moral and spiritual passions that have been connected with people taking the measures that help our ancestors get their DNA into the future, plugging into passions for what is good and right, and maybe even experienced by some of us because of how we evolved as sacred. There is a battle at the center of any civilization creating species between two coherent forces. I'll be back to show those forces. They are an inevitable consequence of seeing the breakthrough into civilization in an evolutionary perspective. Good and evil are at the center of the drama. The evil we unleash, inevitably, and the good that we embody, because that was what served to help life of our ancestors get into the future, and we are that future. These are ways of seeing this toss-up between human civilization destroying itself or getting its act together to survive for the long haul. That drama has been between good and evil, two coherent forces, whatever we want to call them, has been at the center of the drama of the human species since we took that fateful step, and will be at the center of any civilization creating creature's drama. And the more clearly we understand that, the more empowered we're going to be to fight that battle and win it. Fight that battle and win it is how I end the speech that I gave as a Democratic nominee for Congress here in the very much in the conservative red area of what was then the 6th District of Virginia. And if I can remember, old man that I am, I will also post a link to that website where it's a 6-minute thing, and it ends with talking about how that force that had already visibly made the destructive, the Republican Party of 2012, I say in that speech, it was not our father's Republican Party. It was already obvious. It is much bigger than Donald Trump, this problem. And I had some naive beliefs about how you could turn things around, about how you could reach the good people who had been conned into believing things that were not true. It was harder than I thought. I'm not sure how to do it. But I concluded with saying, this destructive force is not the friend of the deep the values that I heard from the conservatives I did talk radio with for a decade. I went through all the, Christian constitutional character, all that stuff. It's the opposite of those things. And then I call upon, and this is at a Labor Day banquet among Democrats in the district, 300 and some people. And then I call upon, a call to battle. And that call to battle still stands. Let's fight this war and win it. The immediate war is the upcoming election. And then there'll be a lot more work to do to bring good people back to the better angels of their nature, and to consign forces that used to be rather marginal in the American political world, like when Eisenhower's Republican Party would consign the John Birch Society and the crazies to, to the margin, and the first Bush president would not accept having David Duke from the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, as associated with, this is the Republican Party. That was the old Republican Party, and we're going to need that Republican Party again, because today's Republican Party has all of those pretty much in the driver's seat. Not the only driver's seat. I think the plutocracy is the main driver's seat, but there's an alliance there of forces of brokenness that needs to be defeated. We have so many arenas in which so much territory has been lost. I started out with the Supreme Court. I don't know how to solve that problem. I think I can say that the first thing is to really raise the alarm that we got a serious problem. And then we got a problem with the good, decent people that make up conservative America. A large proportion of them, if you met in any other domain, you would think, surely when they enter into the political domain, they must play a really lovely role. I mean, at least a big chunk of what you find out there. But that's not the case. And how do you move them so that the goodness that they bring to other parts of their lives, they also bring to the power realm, where they've been somehow transformed into a base that's like that group of Bavarian rural folk that we see at the beginning in that scene in Cabaret that I told about, where what starts out as a sweet song ends up being a Nazi anthem. But the immediate thing is to make sure that the powers of the presidency are in the hands of someone who will hand over those powers in 2028 to a successor, and will make decisions that are within the realm of maintaining the rule of law and the constitutional order, and not the opposite. When I look at these things, it does hurt. But they never promised us a rose garden. I just grew up expecting more of a rose garden on some of these things than the United States that we've got right now, which is something I never thought I'd see. Thanks for listening.